Thank you, Ambassador Sakurai, for the generous introduction. And welcome, everybody, and good evening, and welcome to Japan Society. Now, when I was asked to moderate this event, my first reaction was, geez, I just finished reading a 340-page book to do an event on Meiji Japan, on women. And they said it was an author. I said, well, a book? Yeah, another big, thick book. And so I thought, nah, I don't want to do this. But when I heard that it was about the internment and that it would feature Richard Reeves, that's when my mind changed. And for two reasons. One, because it's personal. I am the son of an internee. And as a journalist, that's full disclosure. My father, Hideo, was, in the eyes of the U.S. government, citizen number 23849D. He, his brothers, his mom and dad, joined the other relatives, the Terasakis, the cousins and uncle and aunt, and they were sent to the Assembly Center in Turlock in Northern California. Then they were railroaded down to the Gila River concentration camp in Arizona, and that's where the two families were split. The Terasakis remained in the Gila River. The Katayamas were sent to this place called Tule Lake, a camp that deserved its own chapter in Reeves' book, in which he cites a judge as saying it was worse than a federal penitentiary with its unheated latrines, a camp operated under martial law. And my father left camp 4 years later at the age of around 22 or 23. 4 years he could have been spent in college. Instead, he wound up going to college at night. Now, I want to fast forward to April of this year. I was in Washington sitting, hearing Prime Minister Abe do this historic address of the joint session of Congress, just a few weeks after Bibi had done so. And as he finished, for some weird reason, my thoughts turned to the internment. I thought about what horrible things the lawmakers in Congress at that time might have been saying about the Japanese enemy, but more so about their fellow citizens, Americans of Japanese ancestry. And instead of dwelling on that, my mind turned to the positive, and I started thinking, as I saw this ornate chamber, my country, America, is big-hearted enough to say, we're sorry, we are wrong. Here's a $20,000 check in monetary reparations. Yes, it took a generation, the third generation of Japanese Americans, to say, hey, that was wrong, you guys have got to apologize. But America did it. A lot of other countries can take a lesson. Congress passed the legislation. President Reagan signed it into law. Now, the second reason for saying yes, I was told, as I said earlier, the guest was Richard Reeves, the celebrated, noted, prize-winning columnist, author, and journalist. Now, he's known, I'm sure many of you know him for his presidential biographies on Reagan, Nixon, and Kennedy. But he's had this great career where he spanned print, television, and film. He's currently a senior lecturer at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Ironically, Los Angeles is where I was born, and New York is where I'm living. New York is where Richard was born and was raised, but he's living in Los Angeles right now. Now, as he himself says in his latest book, Infamy, hope you've had a chance to read it, a lot of books have been written about the internment. Hundreds, I think he said. But I spoke to several scholars before tonight's event, and they said, what makes this one different is that we're talking about a big-name author, and the book is being published by a mainstream commercial press. This is not an academic published by a university press. And in that vein, one legal scholar said, in some way, perhaps the story about the internment, the way that the Americans have grasped it most recently, was Michelle Malkin's version, the revisionist version she put out, and she got a lot of press and publicity for it. And so, in that light, this is perhaps the first popular book on the history of the internment, on the incarceration of Japanese Americans since Malkin's work. And so, Reeves' work, his book, carries a lot of weight. And we at the Japan Society are grateful that he's here to share his thoughts with us, a person, a biographer of the presidents, now writing about one president's decision that had such an impact on the lives of Japanese Americans, inflicting shame and hardship on them. Now, before we begin, I just want to remind you that I'm not sure you're of the generation that tweets a lot or uses a lot of social media, but if you do, our Twitter handle is Japan Society, that's one word. Richard, do you have a handle or a Twitter account? No. Okay, he doesn't. But everybody else. Okay. But despite my gray hairs, I do tweet. And my handle, if you refer to me, is Freddy the Cat. Freddy with an I-E. Cat is the K for Katayama. A CNN colleague of mine back when I used to work there gave me that nickname, and it's sort of stuck. So with that, I turn my mic over to a fellow scribe, Richard Reeves.
I think that's about the most flattering introduction I've ever had. I hope I can come close to living up to it. I never thought, actually, I actually think, using words of one syllable, that Michelle Malkin is a fool, and that I hadn't thought about her. In fact, it's actually been the first time I've heard her mentioned in a long time. But the one way she's relevant, at least to my work, is that she wrote a defense, basically, of American intelligence and its effect on the magic cables, for people who are students of this, on the president. And she was totally wrong, I think, in larger sense that, and a large part of what my book and my own thinking is about, is that the president, a great man, Franklin Roosevelt was a great man by almost any definition, but he knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew that the Imperial Japanese did not have the capability of attacking the mainland United States. All of that. He also, it didn't start with Watergate, one might say. The most informed American at that time on Japanese, very few Japanese Americans spoke Japanese, much less Caucasians speaking Japanese, but a man named Ken Riegel, Lieutenant Commander Riegel of the United States Navy, who had worked in the embassy in Tokyo for 6 years. His son also was a scribe, was a reporter for the Washington Post. And Riegel was given the authority to take safecrackers from San Quentin, the prison in California, who broke into the safes of Japanese consulates around the country and knew what the Imperial Japanese thought of the American Japanese. And what those stolen documents told Riegel, and Riegel's words got to the president, was that the Japanese consulates had been given orders from Tokyo to make no attempts to try to utilize American Japanese as spies or saboteurs, that the American Japanese were more American than the Americans. And these were the words from Tokyo: why don't we try to see what we can do with communists and Jews? And Roosevelt and other people making the decisions in Washington knew all these things. And so that I never actually thought, I read her work obviously, but never thought about the fact of how directly opposite we used the same material. And my book is not about the Japanese, Imperial or American, and it's not about Japanese Americans. It's about Americans on both sides of the barbed wire. To the extent I could, I found out what life was like for the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, and concentration camps was the word that Franklin Roosevelt used in private meetings. The word, as we know, took on a different meaning. Partly, one of the incidents in the book, Japanese-American troops from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team were the first Allied troops to reach Dachau. And when they got to Dachau, the Germans had run. The prisoners, mostly Jewish, in the things, thought that these young men they saw, the average height of the Nisei, the 30,000 Nisei who fought in the United States Army, 18,000 of them who became casualties, the average height was 5'2". One of the major problems was providing them with uniforms. When the German concentration camp prisoners saw these small young men, Japanese-American men coming, they thought they were Japanese who had been sent to kill them. And there are some heartwarming things and many heartbreaking things in this story, but the young Japanese soldiers were on their knees begging the Holocaust survivors, saying, "You're free, you're free, we're Americans, we're Americans." And that was one side, the heroism of the Japanese Americans, the Nisei, was almost unbelievable, but so was the racism, which I will go back to. The Japanese Americans, the 442nd, also were the first American troops to reach, Allied troops, to reach Rome. And they and that was a very big thing. It was the first Axis capital that we were going to capture. It was one of the signals that the Allies were going to win the war. When the soldiers of the 442nd reached the outskirts of Rome, they were ordered by General Mark Clark, who actually was their commander and also was a great champion of them, said many times he thought that they were the most effective soldiers in both the American and British armies. However, they were ordered to stand in place for 2 days so that white troops could be brought up in trucks to liberate Rome. And then the Nisei, the Japanese Americans, were put on those same trucks and taken around to go back to fighting in the north of Italy. December 7th, by sundown on December 8th of 1941, the leadership, the community leaders of the Japanese American community on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, more than 3,000 were rounded up from lists that had been prepared by the FBI. Those lists were pretty much like the membership of a Rotary Club. None of these people had done anything wrong or were even suspected of having done anything wrong, but they were the community leaders. They were the lawyers, the doctors, the businessmen, the journalists, the priests, and they were rounded up by the Justice Department, by the FBI, and taken to Justice Department facilities, prisons, around the country. Often there were only 13 women among that group of 3,000 people. One of the women happened to be one of the people whose family could not find out where she was or whether she was alive for more than a year. The Japanese American, her family, she was from Aberdeen, Washington. Her family, young children, the oldest of them 14, were left to fend for themselves in that little town where people would come in. It was a variety shop with export ceramics and things from Japan, where people would come in and smash everything on the shelves in front of the children and then spit on the children. At the same time, for a couple of weeks, there was sort of a plea. There was a plea for tolerance. These are Americans. They are as patriotic and as good as anyone else. That lasted for about 2 weeks, and it was really the press that led the campaign against Japanese Americans, particularly the Hearst Press and the Los Angeles Times. Los Angeles Times would run front page stories with headlines like "Little Brown Men Being Trained to Rape White Women." That was from the Los Angeles Times. And there were all sorts of horror stories, ridiculous things, that Japanese farmers had placed their farms to be near defense plants, power plants, army bases, etc. Well, the truth of the matter was that the Japanese farmers, Japanese-American farmers, were there long before the factories or the wires or the military bases, because that was the worst land in California, and they were the only people willing to try to farm it. And farm it they did, and farm it well. 40% of the agricultural product of California in 1940 was produced by Japanese-American farmers, people who could not, after the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924, become citizens of the United States. American immigration law going back to 1790 said that the only people who could be naturalized were free white males. That was then added to in 1924 to specifically exclude Japanese and Chinese from being citizens. And Japanese Americans, the Nisei, the second generation, who were born in the United States, were citizens. And they were 2/3 of the 120,000 Japanese Americans, American Japanese, who were taken in sealed trains, first to racetracks and livestock exposition farms, county fairgrounds, and literally put in stables. For as long as 5 and 6 months, people who had been living ordinary lives, who suddenly had had their bank accounts frozen and could bring only what they could carry, which meant a suitcase, sometimes 2 suitcases or a suitcase and a baby, to live in stables. Many of the people I talked to could never forget the smell of horse urine. After 18,000, for instance, were held in Santa Anita, 8,000 in Tanforan and San Bruno outside of San Francisco, in the worst conditions. Sickness was common, epidemic was common, and under the rules promulgated by the Army, the rules were basically based on what the Germans had done, what the Nazis had done in Germany. That is, if anyone had 1 drop of Japanese blood, they were considered, even if they were citizens, the word citizen suddenly disappeared and they became aliens and non-aliens. The kids who were American citizens, the young people, were identified not as Americans, but as non-aliens. How bad was it? They scoured the orphanages of the West Coast to find any children of Japanese ancestry in the orphanages so that they could take them away. They checked all of the adoption records for the 3 states. If any Japanese child had been adopted by Caucasians, that child was taken away in the trains. And so that while they were in the stables, really, 10 camps were built around the country. Calling them camps, they were concentration camps, as Roosevelt said. Roosevelt, by the way, believed in eugenics. He was a man of his generation, and he believed that the Japanese problem, as he called it, was the shape of their skulls. That is, the shape of their skulls, if you measured them, if people know what eugenics was, made them aggressive, and it would take 2,000 years for them to reach the civilization level of white people. Well, we know it didn't take. But that's what the man believed. Racism was much more open in this country than, much more than it is now. And what drove the press impressed politicians and finally reached the president. What drove the incarceration of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast, all of the action we're talking about happened west of the Sierras and the Cascades. The rest of the country, people barely knew this was happening or didn't know it was happening, and even today don't know it was happening. But military zones were created, and the Earl Warren, then the review in the Los Angeles Times of my book said that it had the most arresting group of villains of anything since Antigone. It then said continued on page whatever, and I thought, maybe they're going to compare me to Sophocles. I wouldn't mind that. But the villains were Franklin Roosevelt, Earl Warren, Edward R. Murrow, who was a resident of Washington, warning that the Japanese were about to come to kill white women. And Earl Warren, who was the Attorney General of California at that time, he rode the Japanese to become governor and, as we know, Chief Justice of the United States. He posited and sold the theory that the fact that there had never been a single act of Japanese sabotage or even spying in the United States, espionage, was proof that they were secretly taking orders from Tokyo and holding back to launch a massive, what was then called a fifth column attack from inside the United States to be coordinated with an attack on the West Coast. The most famous cartoon showing that was ran in PM here in New York, a left-wing newspaper, showing buck-toothed, eyeglass-wearing Japanese coming down the West Coast to a store in California where they were being called Fifth Column, where they were handed dynamite for the inevitable attack. And they were watching with telescopes, and the caption was, "Waiting for the signal from Tokyo." The cartoonist was named Theodore Geisel, better known now as Dr. Seuss. That's how deep prejudice was. The other huge factor was greed. The Japanese were relatively prosperous in the California and Oregon and Washington as farmers, fishermen, businessmen on the West Coast. Their bank accounts were frozen on December 8 of 1941. If your bank account is frozen, you can't pay mortgages, you can't pay insurance. Under California law promulgated by Attorney General Warren, the property then was declared abandoned and was distributed at fire sale prices to white neighbors. Now, in some cases, rare but enough, white neighbors protected the land of their Japanese American neighbors and preserved it, and when the war was over, gave them the profits or half the profits of what had been made from that land on the time. But that was very rare, and that was the exception. What was not the exception was simply taking people's houses, taking people's land, and most of whom never came back or never tried to claim it. The camps themselves, the Japanese Americans were told that they were being put there for their own protection. Of course, when they got there, they saw that the machine guns and tanks and searchlights were pointed in, not out. And they were behind barbed wire, many of them for 4 years. The searchlight, it was particularly terrible for women because the tar paper shacks built in the western states, in high deserts and in the swamps of Arkansas, were in places where no one had ever lived, and no one has ever lived since, and where the temperatures in the summer reached 120 degrees, and the temperatures in the winter reached 30 degrees below zero. In the camps, fathers would dig foxholes under the barracks and put their children in them in the summer during the day, because that was the coolest place. They could leave them all day before the sun would begin to drop. The conditions were infinitely worse than were the conditions in the prisoner of war camps that we had in the United States, which we held hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners who were allowed privileges to work outside the camps, to go into the towns, and life being inevitable. So there were no American men. The American men were off to war. Many of those prisoners of war married American women and are now part of us. A part of this book is a story about the fact that every immigrant group who has come to the United States, forgetting slavery, forgetting the Indians, the Chinese and the railroads, the Northern Europeans, farming, the Northern Midwest, the Irish need not apply, the Jews, Italians and Eastern Europeans working the steel mills and the slaughterhouses, were all discriminated against, were all treated as not being like us. They were not like us, and this is an important point of the book, until they were us, and they are us. It's the one redeeming factor, and I'll stop here with the other redeeming factor. It's impossible for me to tell you how badly Earl Warren behaved as Attorney General, then Governor of California. And it was he who convinced the most important newspaper man and public intellectual in the country, Walter Lippmann, that the fact that there had never been a single act of sabotage or espionage was proof positive that they were waiting for orders from Tokyo. Lippmann wrote 2 columns in the Washington Post and 500 other newspapers saying that we had to incarcerate the Japanese because of this. 2 days after he wrote those columns, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which created the military zones, which made it possible to evacuate any enemy aliens, with a few exceptions. They accepted Joe DiMaggio's parents in San Francisco and Fiorello LaGuardia's parents, who were also enemy aliens, and the only people taken from those military zones were the Japanese Americans, 120,000 of them. If we applied the same rules to Germans and Italians, who also we were at war with, we would have had to build concentration camps for 50 million people, which is why the Japanese were the ones that politicians and the press seized on in the hysteria and the fear at the beginning of World War II. If there is redemption, and we are a country of redemption, I certainly like to think we are. We're certainly a country of the present. We don't look back. I traveled this country, and even today, most of the people I talked to who are not on the West Coast never knew any of this happened. I remember talking to a Japanese-American couple in Indianapolis. She was a nurse, he was an accountant. They lived in Indianapolis for 25 years. Many of the Japanese Americans stayed in the Middle West rather than go back to the West Coast. In 25 years living in Indianapolis, they had never met a single white person who knew that there had been camps, and I heard that story again and again. Back to redemption, there was no doubt in my mind that his behavior in 1942, by his, I mean Earl Warren, was directly led to Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, the desegregation decision in 1954. And I'll close with one short anecdote about that. California does very extensive oral histories of their governors. And the oral history of Earl Warren, which was done by a woman named Amelia Fry at University of California, Berkeley, lasted 6 days. And it was only on the 6th day that Amelia Fry said, "Mr. Chief Justice, Governor, I want to ask you about the events of 1942. Earl Warren broke into tears, stood up, walked out, and never came back. He knew what he had done. Most of America still doesn't. Thank you.
I'm going to try to fit in as many questions as I can in the limited time I have available. And I know the answer to this question, but for the sake of our audience here, having read the book, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, why did you write this book? As you mentioned yourself, so many books have been written about the internment.
Right.
What did you hope to contribute? What did you hope to bring?
I hope there have been hundreds of, only beginning in the 1970s, because the government had no reason to talk about all of this, and Japanese Americans didn't talk to their children about it. They were ashamed of what happened, and they simply didn't talk about it. And then with the beginning of the Black Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s, the conversation began about what did you do during the Troubles, during the war. And then a literature began to emerge, mostly books written for children or legal tracts about the illegality of this. I wrote this because I don't want it to happen again. And the laws that made this possible, even though there have been Supreme Court decisions, the laws have never been declared unconstitutional. We could round up the Muslims tomorrow. We could round up the border crossers tomorrow. And I wanted to do my bit to see that didn't happen.
Yeah, I think the words you used in your book was did not negate the Supreme Court decisions.
Right.
And so you feel that this could happen again.
Yes, the Supreme Court decisions in cases like Korematsu and were only on technicalities. They did not address the overall right of the government to round up people who were never charged with anything other than having a different colored skin.
Then in order for this never to happen again, do you think that something has to be done to rewrite it, to eradicate that thing? Because I've asked other people.
Right.
Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey, for example, had a pivotal role in the redress movement. And he said, as a former history teacher in high school, that he thought that education was the best deterrent for this not to happen again. I also think about the current generation, the millennials, many of whom, poll after poll show, we don't consider race an issue. We certainly aren't the post-racial society we've seen over the past few months. But what then steps do you think need to be taken in order to ensure this does not happen again? Is there any movement on that?
No, I think that education and publicity and awareness are the real defense against this. To say nothing also of social media. It's hard to imagine in this day and age when information moves so quickly and so widely that these kind of things could happen. But probably in 1940, if we were sitting at a forum, we would say, well, things like, this can't happen here. Well, it did happen here, and it could happen here, and education is the answer, because the Supreme Court does not change its mind. Robert Jackson, who became the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, but was then a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, said in a dissent of these decisions, said that what was done to the Japanese Americans is like a loaded gun on the Constitution, and it's still there, and it's still there today. On the West, as you know, school, there are parts of the curriculum, beginning in the 6th grade, that talk about this, but not in the rest of the country.
Yeah, and I went to Jesuit prep school, and I don't recall reading about it when I grew up in the books. If my father
Is
had
that
told
true?
me,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have known about it.
When did your father tell you?
When I was probably elementary school in my teenage years, and I remember he cast it in a way that didn't seem so evil. And I thought it was more like a Boy Scout summer camp until I saw the movie, the NBC movie, Farewell to Manzanar.
Yeah.
Remember, we watched it as a whole family, and he said, and I said, this couldn't be the sort of camp you went to. And they were lining up for latrines, lining up the mess. I was, no, that's exactly what it looked like. And I remember just being totally shocked at that point.
Well, one of the amazing things about the camps was that the incarcerated people, the Japanese Americans and American Japanese, did turn them into small American towns. They were on a prisoner of war model. The conditions were terrible, but in Manzanar, for instance, there were 80 baseball leagues. There were thousands of Boy Scout troops in all of the camps. And the young people, older than you, they were Americans. They were like Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland Americans with sock hops, and formed their own schools, yearbooks, cheerleaders, football teams, baseball teams. They were Americans. There was never any question about who they were.
You also wrote the biographies of other presidents, Reagan, Nixon, Kennedy among them. Did you ever see any instance where the presidents were tempted to push the boundaries of the Constitution the way FDR did? I mean, Deputy Secretary of War John J. McCloy called the Constitution a scrap of paper.
Right. John McCloy was Deputy Secretary of War, said, I'm a Wall Street lawyer. The Constitution's just a scrap of paper to me. Did I see it in other presidents? I saw it in all other presidents. Unfortunately, there is a dark strain in American history. If I start with the presidents I've written about, obviously Nixon was very adept at breaking the law, but John Kennedy was running with his brother an assassination ring around the world, and that may well be why he ended up being the person assassinated. Ronald Reagan was illegally raising money himself and funding wars in Latin America, all of it unconstitutional. One of the things, Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, was against the incarceration. And Franklin Roosevelt said to her what he said to the 2 or 3 other people who came to him and said, this is wrong. He said, I don't want to hear about this again. And that line I found in every presidency, that Kennedy, when people came to talk about the attempts to assassinate Castro, I don't want to hear any more about that. And because they're the president, they don't hear about it again.
Eleanor Roosevelt, by the way, I think you pointed out, visited the Gila River camp in Arizona, right, among other things.
At the same time, by the way, Easter week, 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt was at Gila River. Her husband was traveling to Army bases. By then, mid-1943, there were once again Japanese Americans in the U.S. military, most of them from the camps or from Hawaii. And when Roosevelt visited those camps, at gunpoint, the Japanese American soldiers were locked in hangars and kept there so that he would not see them and they would not see him.
Um, in your book, you plainly called out the heroes and the villains.
Right.
And one question I had, and those of us who read these books over the years know the names of the villains, and often the villains are the ones that surprise you. For example, the ones you named, many of them progressives, liberals, whether they're folks in the media. Now, on the other hand, the conservatives, you have people like J. Edgar Hoover, who turns out on the good side.
J. Edgar Hoover was against the incarceration. Whether he was on the good side or not, I was never able to determine because he was in a turf war with the Army, and he wanted the FBI, the Justice Department, to be in charge of the incarceration. So he attacked the fact that the Army was rounding up people. And to his credit, FBI intelligence to the president told the president and the Army that the Japanese Americans were almost universally loyal to the country. That's why they allowed themselves to go into the camps and were no threat to anyone.
Did you ever figure out why those who got it right, and those who got it wrong? Was there any common strain behind it? Was it, for example, a respect for the Constitution?
I think it was, I hate to say this for the two of us, the ones who got it wrong were people with political careers, as opposed to even military careers, and they responded to what the press was reporting, and the press was reporting had no relation to reality. It had relation only to hysteria, to fear, to racism, to greed.
Also in your book, by the way, what I think characterizes the book is pretty comprehensive. It tells a huge tale, many tales, all chapters, whether it's the 442nd or the tales of the Latin American Japanese who were interned here in the United States, and camps of vignettes of everyday life that you also put in. But one thing that I found missing, and I was just curious as to why, you did talk about Kazuo Masuda, the staff sergeant in the Army who was not allowed to be buried at the cemetery in Orange County, California, because they locked the gates, right, the locals. And in the end, Vinegar Joe, sergeant comes in and says, all right, we're going to do this. And they hold this huge ceremony and a bowl. But there was also that connection of that story that played a pivotal role in the redress reparations movement of getting Reagan to overturn his opposition to it. And I was wondering why that wasn't in the book.
I don't know. I didn't realize that had an effect on Reagan's thinking. The reparations, I don't have a very positive view of the reparations. After all, they were only paid up in 1994, $20,000, and you had to be they were a pittance compared to what people lost, and you had to survive. If someone was already dead, they did not do it. Gerald Ford made the formal apology, as you mentioned, and Reagan was influenced as much as anything, not by the events in Orange County and General Stilwell coming. In many American towns, by the way, the Army had to come in for the Japanese to get back into their homes, if their homes still existed. Many were burned to the ground. But the Orange County Register, the most conservative newspaper in the country, then the first real libertarian newspaper, a man named R.C. Hoyles, from day one had said this is against the Constitution, and he was a friend of Reagan's and a great supporter of Reagan's, and I suspect he may have been the middleman in that mind change, but I'm not sure.
Because the story
Since
of
both of the men are gone, right?
The story of Masuda, we had this event at the Aegis Society where we invited the chief strategic legislative official for the Japanese-American Citizens League and Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey to reconstruct the chain of events that happened. But what happened with Kazuo Masuda was that a young Army captain named Ronald Reagan was sent to talk at that ceremony with the sand in a bowl, and in this eloquent way said something to the effect of the sand, the color of blood on sand has no color, is only of one color. And what happened was, because of Reagan's fiscal conservatism, he didn't want to spend any money, wanted to lower spending, and this reparations bill he wanted to support, but he couldn't because of the money issue. And what got him over the board was Governor Tom Kean handed him a letter written by Kaz Masuda's sister saying, "Do you remember you spoke so eloquently at my brother's funeral, the ceremony? Will you please support our drive for redress?" And Reagan saw that and called Governor Kean back and said, "I'm supporting it. I'm going for the bill."
This is the worst thing about being an author. If I had known that story, of course, I would have used it, including the fact that her picture is in the book
It is.
when General Stilwell comes. But I've been back and forth across the country now talking about this with a lot of different kinds of audiences, and some people have attacked me who said it was the kind of Michelle Malkin line. It was totally justified. It wasn't, but they think it was, and I probably have 100 stories like that I wish I knew at the time. I shut down the computer.
Okay.
I knew the whole thing about the family and whatnot, but I didn't know of Reagan's involvement.
I see, yeah. I'll get you some material on that. But
Yeah,
I heard the
I
story
hope
myself.
so.
Governor
Right.
Kean told us
Right.
the story. And there's one other thing.
Where was Governor Kean when I needed him?
He actually rode a car with Reagan
Yeah.
when Reagan was campaigning in New Jersey and told Reagan. Reagan first said, "No, I heard that it was for protective custody." And Kean said, "No, it wasn't. It wasn't." And then he said, "Yeah, I'd love to support it, but that fiscal conservatism." And Duberstein, his aides, looked at him and but then once he saw the letter, he said, "I'm going
Wow.
for it." Yeah, a powerful story. But another question, this being the journalist in me, and I take this constructively. There was that you talked about the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scouts,
Right.
and one story in your book was a famous story often told about former Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta being the Cub Scout,
Right.
meeting Senator Alan Simpson in Wyoming when he was at the Hart Mountain, Wyoming
Right.
camp as an intern.
Scoutmaster and Cody got the idea to have a joint camporee with the Scouts at Hart Mountain, and Mineta and Alan Simpson, who were lifetime friends after that, shared a pup tent at that camporee.
And I think you went on to say that Mineta and Simpson sponsored the legislation that led to the Civil Liberties
Yes.
Act of 1980. But I just wanted to put it for the record. From every story I've heard, and I've looked at the documents on the internet, Simpson did not sponsor the bill. He was a co-sponsor. And then Jesse Helms put out an amendment called the Helms Amendment to strip the money out of the bill, but just be an apology. And Simpson voted in favor of that amendment. In the end, he voted in favor of the legislation that went through. But the person
I voted against it before I voted for it.
You heard that during the campaign. But it was Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii who sponsored that legislation, buttonholed the lawmakers, got 70 of the 72 senators to back him, and even buttonholed a young legislative intern for Senator Alan Cranston of California, a Democrat, whose vote was assured, to make sure he got it through. And so it was Spark Matsunaga as opposed to Senator Alan Simpson, despite his approval. But I just want to point that out.
Wyoming is a very conservative state.
It definitely is, yeah.
Simpson, who I never forgave for what he said during the Clarence Thomas hearings, was a lovely man, a funny man, a smart man, but really an ideological conservative. And of course, as we know, I wish you would work on the book with
we
me.
should have done it together. Maybe. No, but he's the bigger name. See, that's
but the games they play in the Senate are designed so that the public won't quite understand what's happening.
Another question I have, looking at it in a broader context, you know, as a historian, as a journalist, we often use euphemisms, whether it's relocation centers for the camps and whatever. But Americans talk about this as the good war.
Right.
Others will say there never was a good war, there never was a bad peace. Others have said, no, it wasn't a good war, it was a race war. And from what you've seen over the years, there was also the Nazis and the Jews, there was the racist caricatures of the Japanese enemy and mistreating the Japanese-Americans. Do you see World War II in a different light after having done this book?
I don't think I see it in a different light, but I certainly see it in more shades and in different colors, including the fact that when you look at what happened in the United States in 1942, you then have to go into what led up to World War II, and also what were some of the effects of World War II. And one of the effects was that the victories of the Imperial Japanese, first in the Russo-Japanese War, the first time an Asian people had defeated a Caucasian people in war, which shocked the world. And then the events that followed World War II in Asia, there's no doubt that the Pacific War was a race war. And I mean, I think most Americans think we were on the right side of it. But the fact of the matter is that the conquest by the Imperial Japanese through Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, then the Dutch East Indies, led to a remaking of the world. I don't think there's been an Indonesian president after a certain point who had not been a soldier in the Japanese army. So to them, to the Indonesians, I guess the second or third largest country in the world, it was a race war. And the Dutch were vicious colonists. The smaller the colonial power, the more vicious their policies, Vietnam being one example. But there is no doubt that the race war aspects of World War II were what led to what is now the New Asia.
And I have two other questions before I turn to the audience. One of the folks who praised your book on the cover, you've got your buddy Tom Brokaw there. What do you make of his phrase, the greatest generation?
I think it was a great gimmick. I don't know that they were the greatest generation. They were pretty much an ignorant generation, a racist generation, an ingrown generation. It was, if they became the greatest generation and if they made this a greater country, which I think they did, it is because for the first time, America had to reach out to the world. They had to see how other people lived. I think among our biggest faults today, and then it was universal, was that we think everyone wants to be like us. They don't want to be like us. The Muslims don't want to be like us. They think we're a decadent people, but they sure would like to have what we have. And I think that's universal across the world, across the Middle East, and that one time after another, we have ignored the most visible of history to think that people want us to come in and tell them how to run their countries. And again, it doesn't work out. Occupation never works out, but we do it over and over again. Now, on the other hand, one of the strengths of being an American is we don't live in the past. We don't fight wars about things that happened in the year 1100 in Kosovo. We are always moving forward. And often that's a great, great asset. We're willing to try things that failed in the past because we don't know they failed in the past. Unfortunately, we also repeat things that failed in the past, and they fail in the present, and they will fail in the future. Okay. But we are such a different kind of people. When I say Americans on both sides of the barbed wire, this is the only society, I think if someone asked me, what's most different about America? We're the only people who raise our children to leave home. Every other society that I'm aware of raises their children to serve the family, the country, the religion. Not us. We want them out.
Yeah, my wife keeps talking about my 8-year-old son, saying, I don't want him to go away from college. You do. Why? My last question is this. I started with the front of the book. I'm going to the end now, where you, in your list of acknowledgments, It includes one name that I was curious about his reaction, Barack Obama. What did the president say?
Well, I had full disclosure. My daughter is a special assistant to the president, and she's the head of the presidential communications. When her mom, I'll tell the whole story. When her mom was dying, my wife, at UCLA, Fiona, my daughter, my wife was a Democratic politician, actually, arranged for Obama to call her. He called her. We were sitting, family was sitting in the hospital room, and my wife, who was some piece of work, the phone came and he said, "This is Barack Obama," and my wife thought it was a tape and said, "You don't have to go on. We're for you, whatever you do. Goodbye." And I said, "Catherine, that was Barack Obama." Luckily, he realized what had happened, and 2 minutes later, my cell phone rang again, and I said, "Catherine, this is the president." So that's why he's acknowledged in the book.
I see. Thank you.
I had no idea anybody would notice that.
On the very last page.
Yeah.
Just a quick question for you, because I know you've done extensive research on this topic, is aside from Hawaii and just in, I guess, the West Coast area, what percentage would you say of Japanese Americans weren't interned and got out?
Were interned and then got out?
No, just weren't interned at all. Like, just didn't get rounded up.
Less than 5%. Okay. If you lived in New York, for instance, Isamu Noguchi, the great sculptor, was a New Yorker, and he voluntarily went into the camps, but the subject never came up. I mean, one of the worst things about when you said Pearl Harbor, was that the Imperial Japanese had only one submarine in 1942 between Hawaii and the United States. And there was hysteria everywhere. The Battle of Los Angeles, it was called, where they fired anti-aircraft guns for 8 hours at a Navy weather balloon because they thought it was the Imperial Air Force. At the same time, off the coast of New Jersey, 10 and 12 ships a day were being sunk by German submarines. So that the threat, Pearl Harbor, obviously, politicians, and obviously Franklin Roosevelt, one of the greatest who ever lived, of course he was going to use to build up morale. One of the things that comes across in the book, the Bataan Death March, was never reported in the United States until a year and a half after it happened, because it was thought it would hurt morale. And so that the whole question of mobilizing a democratic people to fight an all-out war, which Roosevelt did brilliantly, but a lot of that had to do with using Pearl Harbor and the Imperial Japanese as a greater threat than they actually were. I'm not defending them, obviously, but they never could had the capability to do what we were being told they could do.
All right. And with that, we'd like to take your question, but because time is up, we do have a reception after. You can see over there in the foyer. So I hope you'll be able to ask Richard your questions then. Just want to say thank you all for coming. Thank you, Richard, for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.